Hey everyone, welcome back to Office Hours. I'm Julian Zelizer, and this is the Long View, as you know. And delighted to be with all of you. And I'll give everyone a few minutes as you sign on. Let's see. I hope everyone had a nice holiday week and some fun plans for the new year. I was thinking about how much I have enjoyed the Longview being part of the new year. And I know many of you got the announcement about the in the classroom. So I will do it tomorrow. The time isn't exact. It will probably be around 10 or 10:15. Nice to see familiar faces joining in. Let's see. Tomorrow, my newsletter will come out, and it will deal with congressional Republican politics in the year ahead in the midterms. So I look forward to hearing your responses to that. Again, I'm taking a few weeks from my weekly foreign policy column, which I'll start up again in late January, although I have one piece that is coming out, a review of a new PBS documentary about the atomic bomb, which was quite interesting and interesting to write the review. And this week I have scheduled thus far. Then and Now will take place on Friday. My newsletter, hi Robin, will have another profile of one of the historians who I've been looking at for their generation, which is a look at historians who came out of the 1960s and 70s and really remade a lot of history, which I feel now that we're at a time, hi Reba, when history is under attack and the teaching of history is under attack. They're looking at the generation whose work is really the focus of what a lot of this is about. Through interviews is really quite eye-opening and for me illuminating. I also want to create a record of sort, an archive, so that people can understand more of the people who did the work from the generation that came before me. I also have John Fabian Witt will be coming back on Friday at 11:30. Many of you remember John. I interviewed him for his book, The Radical Fund, which was a terrific book about a pocket of money that funded many of the progressive movements of the 20th century. He recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about process and why a devotion and commitment to process in politics has diminished since the 1970s and the implication of what that has meant for our current time. So take a look at the op-ed and then I'll be able to talk to John about that. So as you know, for office hours, for anyone who is new, please just send in questions and thoughts on what's on your mind, and I'm happy to talk about any of them as much as I can. I know many people are following the potential for a deal with Ukraine, uh, and I have not read The Time of Illusion, Don, but thank you for that recommendation and seeing if we are on the cusp of some kind of agreement overseas. I think everyone who has been following understands that we're many steps away from that. And even pronouncements from the White House that a deal is on hand don't necessarily equate with the reality that a deal is on hand. But obviously, I think everyone is hoping for cessation of hostility and warfare, but obviously about doing that in the right way. Yes, it's about Nixon, and it's funny. I was thinking about our conversations in office hours over the year, and really how much President Nixon looms large on so many different topics that we have discussed here and in other parts of the long view. I mean, it is really a presidency that ends in the middle of the second term, and I think has just had such long lasting consequences on many fronts. I mean, you can certainly talk about multiple levels of foreign policy. Um, a- and with détente to covert action in places like Chile or Vietnam, to obviously corruption and the abuse of presidential power, to efforts to play to the silent majority through capitalizing on a backlash to civil rights, and much, much more. I think we often obviously think about Reagan as the most transformative Republican, and obviously he had huge consequence. But I really think Nixon, um, fits the bill in a different way and also shaped the culture that we still live in of the 1970s, of distrust of institutions. It didn't all stem from him for sure, but I think his presidency came to really embody and entrench some of the problems that the country was facing. So he's really a fascinating president and a deeply impactful, not always in the right ways. I think Susan and Ralph have both raised key issues with whatever deal is um, possibly being discussed. One will be what kind of concessions are being demanded of Ukraine. I think there's a lot of reluctance, certainly within Ukraine, but even outside of Ukraine, for granting land that really impinges on the autonomy of Ukraine, and sending the message that sizable acquisition is possible through this kind of aggression, which is a threat, obviously, not simply to Ukraine, but I think many European countries are deeply concerned if this is acceptable. And Susan actually raised another interesting issue, which I don't think you're alone in wondering, Susan, in terms of profit. And I think the profit concern ranges from literally the profits of the first family of Trump's family. This has been a big issue with dealings with countries such as Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. To here, profits both for the U.S. but also for the administration. And Ralph, at least Nixon had diplomacy, I think, is an important point. And there are certainly many ways in which okay, I'm just writing down some of these questions. Um, there's many ways in which you can draw lines of comparisons between President Nixon and President Trump, and I have done that, and I actually think they're incredibly helpful, but there are differences too. I mean, it's part of what we're going to talk with John Fabian Witt about. Even in the Nixon era, there was still a broad commitment to standard traditional political processes. On foreign policy, it is true, the State Department, even as Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, worked around it, created secret back channels to the Soviets back in 1972 for communication, 71 and 72, the State Department was still very deeply relevant. The civil service, the layers of civil service were still much more deeply entrenched, which was in part why Nixon was trying to work around it. And I think what we have seen, which is categorically different in the last few years, is the success at actually dismantling those institutions of diplomacy. So it's no longer a story of Nixon and Kissinger in 71 and 72 working around state as much now as a State Department that in many ways has been eviscerated. That's too strong a word, but deeply, deeply cut into. So those traditional processes and sources of expertise are no longer there. I think that's part of why anyone talking about what might be going on has a million caveats that we don't actually know, because even the flow of information is much more difficult at this point to achieve. And at the second level, there's a sense of instability. Part of what institutions provided in 71 and 72 is some sense of stability when deals were achieved. When you had the diplomatic breakthrough with China in 1972, where you had the SALT I agreements in 1972. Again, even those were often crafted around the State Department. The State Department, the Foreign Policy Corps, was very much in place, and a commitment to process was still pretty widespread in the political system. So there was some confidence that those could be agreed to. This is more like executive action on the domestic front, I think, in the minds of many people. I mean, besides a lack of trust in some of the pronouncements, a lack of confidence in how the follow through might work. You've seen some of this already with the Middle East and the deal that was reached there. I mean, diplomacy is not simply about the art of the deal. Diplomacy is about making sure that the deal struck sticks, and working on that and implementing that. And I don't think everyone is feeling too confident on that front. And it's also a political a politicization of the State Department, in addition to the gutting of it. For sure. I mean, and we've seen this across the board. We're seeing this with the Department of Justice. A lot of these executive agencies have really been shaken since this year began, the year that we're now closing out. I think that's one of the big stories of American politics. It's the way in which Trump 2.0 has profoundly made inroads into the institutional integrity of different agencies. And this is equally why many people are deeply concerned about the Supreme Court pronouncements that have opened the door to what's called the unitary executive theory, because you have a president being granted total control over agencies. At the same time, you're seeing what agencies are doing or having done to them internally. And I think, Don, you're right. I think for a lot of young people, there is an erosion of confidence that's already quite bad, that will manifest itself after what we have seen through the year. I mean, I think there's a cynicism about institutions, again, that grows out of the 1960s and 70s, which can be very healthy. I don't want to diminish all of the cynicism. I mean, some of that was the cynicism that created the FISA court. Some of that was the cynicism that put guardrails on what the government could do in terms of surveillance of American citizens. Some of that cynicism can be productive, but we are in a kind of nihilistic form of cynicism now, which I think when you watch the youth vote helps to explain why there is, a lot of disengagement and a lot of frustration, which is it's a bad trend line. It's not one that's new. I don't want to say this is all a product of the last year. I think it's an era we need to recapture some of the animating spirit that you saw at the height of Nixon's presidency, which I think ended up moving in a different direction. The hope was that kind of activism and that kind of interest would lead to higher rates of voting rather than to disengagement. So, I mean, we will see. One good thing is that as a result, certainly of the last election, I do think both parties, frankly, are paying more attention to not simply young voters, but disengaged voters. There's different terms used, and how to reach them. And we will see how serious the parties are about doing that. I think Democrats, if they are going to win, not simply really in 2026, but in 2028, are going to need to figure out very good strategies for doing that. Lynn, look, people have different thoughts on what's happening. We've certainly had a lot of media conversations about is this an autocratic moment? And I think it's important that the term autocracy is seen, that there's many variations. There's been some good writing in the New Yorker. Andrew Morantz has been comparing and looking at Hungary, for example, over the past few years, and seeing some of the way in which you get a strong state to take form without a moment when it all happens. I mean, he had a great article earlier in the year about visiting the university that had been gutted, and the university is still standing. If you're outside, you still see it. But when he went in, there was not much there, and so I think those are the kinds of fears. If you're not someone who believes in this is a monarchy, autocracy, you could still have a different metric to understand what's called democratic backsliding. And again, you don't need to look overseas for that. The history of the United States is filled with examples and real moments of this. I mean, I think often we look overseas to understand some of the risks of what the country faces. You just have to look to the history of the South and the Jim Crow era, when post Reconstruction, post federal amendments, so many restrictions and anti-democratic policies and institutions were put into place. Is it reversible? Someone just put on the chat. Of course, I think it is. I am not someone who thinks it's not. I do think there's a interesting article by Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times last week or this week, where she talks about ways in which you've seen what some call resistance or opposition taking form. And I think she has a lot of valid points. And I've spoken here about the fact that moments of opposition to a political regime, a presidency, don't always happen very quickly. It takes time. I mean, opposition to power is not easy. So there is a reason you don't see it bubble up in a day. And if you look, when I talk to students about the history of the anti-war movement in Vietnam, they're surprised to learn how long it took. There's an image now that Lyndon Johnson sent ground troops and the protests were everywhere. It really didn't happen that way. The first sit-in was at the University of Michigan in 1965. The administration barely cares about it. Fast forward to 67, public opinion still was in favor of the war. Grassroots college protests were happening for sure, but they were still pretty limited. It's only in April of 1967 when Martin Luther King finally makes a speech at the Riverside Church, a famous speech in which he takes a stand against the war, and it's a galvanizing moment, and so it takes time. So I think assessments that whether it's the No Kings protests that we've seen, it's the work of really much of the judicial system outside of the Supreme Court, or increasingly successful campaign operations from New Jersey, Virginia, New York City, and more. I do think it's fair to say that the resistance is growing. At the same time, there are some, and I'm still the verdict's out, that argue he himself is struggling, President Trump, in ways he was not a couple years ago, just in terms of his stamina, in terms of his schedule, which you can look at, which is diminishing. So we will see. And Cindy, I hear the hope. My point here is not to say it will happen or won't happen, but I do think we need to take a look at ways. I mean, part of what I think President Trump has been very effective at is promoting the notion of political dominance. And then you sit down and you look at the facts on the ground, and I don't think even in a short history of his presidencies that really adds up. I mean, he lost re-election. He does terribly. Republicans have done terribly in midterm and off-year elections, and he himself is struggling tremendously in the polls, including on issues of economics. And so there are ways to see that this is not an FDR or even a Reagan-esque coalition that has taken form. This is something much more fragile and much more easy in many ways to defeat. Again, in an era where we're not talking about landslide elections, the bad news for presidents is they don't have landslide victories and mandates, as Reagan did in '84, for example. And at the same time, it means you're talking about swinging small numbers rather than large numbers to win either power in Congress Again, era of shifting majorities and narrow majorities, or even in the electoral college, where you're talking about slivers of the electorate as a result, as opposed to huge parts of the electorate. And I think this is important to keep in mind. Whether that makes him more dangerous, as someone said, is also an important point. There is a way in which desperation brings out the worst in a leader as opposed to feeling confident. But both things can be true. The president might be acting in ways that are more desperate. At the same time, his vulnerabilities could be very real. Look, this year is ending. I think many agree this was a difficult and turbulent and unstable political year. But the year ahead is beginning, and it's a midterm year. And if we're just looking at the normal cycles of politics, this is when presidents become very vulnerable, their party, and that lame duck status, the normal swings of midterms can have a powerful effect on shifting power. Nothing of that is to say it's inevitable. It will really depend on Democratic strategy. It will depend on voter turnout. It will depend on what happens with the administration in the coming weeks. But we do need to keep all of that in mind. And Janice, I do think there are some who are hoping, and um, I wouldn't underestimate kind of emotional outlook in politics. We don't talk about that, but emotions very important, and they are going to be necessary to drive the kind of campaign and voter mobilization that'll be necessary in the midterms. If it's not there, it will put Republicans in advantage. Midterms traditionally are not simply a mandate on the party in power. They are often places when the opposition party is just more emotionally mobilized than the party in power. I mean, that was part of the story of 2010 and President Obama and the Republicans gaining control as part of 94 when Republicans finally regained control. So that emotion and using that emotion successfully, I think, is an important part of the history of midterm elections. Let me take a break to thank all of the subscribers who are listening, and I really enjoy hearing and seeing from all of you every week. And paid subscribers, as always, are really essential to making this possible so that I can continue doing this work. And I'm have a lot of plans for the year ahead. So if some of you might consider becoming paid subscribers, that would certainly be terrific and lend support to the Longview project, which I remain committed. And Don, I talked about the erosion of executive branch institutions. I think changes in the media have been quite unsettling, which I keep saying is why spaces such as this, and I'm not talking just about my own, but news spaces of news and analysis are really important. I think lots of presidents have attacked the news media. This is not new. Richard Nixon famously threatened Katharine Graham after 1973, trying to get her to back off from Washington Post coverage of Watergate, going after her in many ways, which she did not buckle into. But we've seen with the media, the political pressure that reporters are facing. The story I talked about with Jim Acosta about Pentagon credentials. We see at places like CBS where commercial pressures are being leveraged and often converging with political pressures, and the administration openly threatening and trying to intimidate networks. So it's a difficult time, and you add all of this to a more secular set of challenges the news media has faced in the last 20 or 30 years with declining revenue. Thanks, Janice. I'm glad you enjoyed that. Declining revenue, less viewership or readership, and just economic models that are not working. This is a really fraught time. And so we do need, I think it's important. I know many people are upset with the mainstream media, rightly so. I do think it's important to, excellent. I do think it's important to look at places where you're seeing good reporting and you're seeing executives, whether it's publications or TV or what have you, social media, doing good work. I don't want to have kind of, I think, a look where everything is problematic can erase good voices. And then I do think it's going to be important that sources of support for other kinds of information gain strength in the coming years. Information will continue, reporters will continue, and the news will get out. But I think the challenges after this year have doubled and tripled with a very hostile administration, again, willing to go about what other presidents have done without the guardrails and the processes that other presidents have adhered to, or the basic respect for the importance of the press, even when that press is coming at the president. And we also need to consider. I often say voters are part of the issue. Voters need to think in their decisions about members of Congress or presidents, that they are electing people not simply whose policy agenda aligns with theirs, but who basically respect and will support and defend and adhere to the constitutional system that we set up a long time ago, which is essential to creating a playing field where the partisanship can happen and the partisan divisions can play out without being destructive. And part of this is a respect for news, for analysis, for freedom of the press, for freedom of speech, all of which is not ancillary to a healthy democracy, but actually integral to a healthy democracy. And I think when we talk about young people and the engagement that some of you are putting through the chat, I actually think this is at the forefront of where this will or will not happen. Thank you, everyone, for joining office hours. Tomorrow, the newsletter will drop in the morning. I'm going to do for paid subscribers in the classroom around 10 or 10:15, subject to be determined, and all the interviews later this week. Thanks for joining, everyone. And if I don't hear from some of you, have a great new year. And we have a lot of great stuff on the long view coming up. Bye bye.